vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcuri de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
внутреннего стяг. В жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 4th of October, 2025. And here we are with a live stream, and we're going to be looking at the recent recent speech given by Putin at the Valdai Club meeting. This is the annual meeting that the Russian political establishment, I think it's fair to say, puts on every year. It attracts something of an international audience, and it always generates some interesting stories coming out of it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that this evening. That and the hysteria gripping the manufactured hysteria gripping the EU and NATO countries regarding potential Russian drone activity, which I think is mostly made up. So we'll come to that in just a moment. But first of all, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Got some new content up on the Patreon at the moment. So we've got the latest review in our series of reviews of Martin Scorsese movies. That's Goodfellas. That's out now on Patreon for those who subscribe. So now let's get into it. Putin did one of his usual mammoth addresses at the Valdai Club. This usually takes the form of a speech, which is around about half an hour, and then 3+ hours of question and answers. And just to say right off the top, it's always impressive the way he keeps it going for hour after hour after hour in these Q&A sessions. This is, of course, the speech and the answers to the questions are well prepared by his team in advance. There's no doubt about that. But the fact that he delivers all this stuff, he remembers facts and figures and various different aspects of policy, which is impressive, genuinely impressive. You couldn't imagine. You can imagine Trump talking for 3.5 hours, but wouldn't make any sense, and it would be a wildly contradictory ride into insanity quite a lot of the time. And I couldn't imagine Keir Starmer talking for 3+ hours about anything. I can imagine Macron doing it, but again, it would just be nonsensical, narcissistic rambling. Most Western politicians wouldn't be able to do that. And I think it's because overwhelmingly it is the case that most of the politicians in the NATO bloc don't actually do most of the governing. Now, of course, Putin is not the czar or dictator that in the West he's portrayed as, but because the Putin-led system is different to the Western system, it is a system which is, of course, Bonapartist, and therefore it involves Putin having to actually govern in a way that, of course, is not done in most of the Western countries. And that's a very interesting distinction to make, because Putin actually is quite genuinely at the center of a decision-making process, rather than as Starmer has, which is that Starmer has decisions handed to him by the state bureaucracy and by the addendums to the state bureaucracy from the think tank world, and then just presents them badly, I might add. That he is basically, this is what the heads of government in the Western system have become, which is they're just automated machines reading out decisions that have already been made, which is why they can be as stupid and as ridiculous as they are. And so Putin is running a different system, and therefore is also a better educated man. I think that must be said as well. Certainly better educated man than Keir Starmer, but then again, perhaps that wouldn't be hard. So interesting from a performance and performance point of view. It's very interesting to have this 3+ hours, and I watched the whole thing with Putin. A lot of it, was interesting. Some of it, always interesting watching these epic performances by Putin, because there's so much in there that we would agree, we as communists would agree with, but also there's so much in there that is disagreeable as well at the same time. So the theme for his speech was the polycentric world, which is interesting. It's a play on the multipolar world. There will be many centers of power, etc., and there'll be no overarching hegemon, which is what Putin has been saying for quite a number of years now. And it's what the leadership of the PRC, People's Republic of China, say as well. So no essential change in the policy direction there. The more interesting thing comes from the fact that the way that this is presented, and again, I should emphasize, like, where it's described, we describe this as Putin's speech, but it's, Putin had a hand in writing it. It would have been written by his advisors, and it would have been written to reflect the state of play inside the Russian government. So it's not just that Putin suddenly decides I'm going to make this speech and does it all off the cuff. It has to be like the points of view expressed by Xi Jinping, or even the points of view expressed by American presidents. It reflects the consensus within the political hierarchy. That's what I would say, and also within the wider ruling class. So this is this is what makes it interesting, because by listening to this, you can see where the consensus in the governing circle in Russia has reached. So just first of all, on the multipolar question, he again didn't change much. He talked about the need to further develop local currency payments and international trade. Talked about the development of BRICS and the importance of ties with all of the BRICS countries. And the point he kept coming back to was that there will be no dominating powers in the polycentric world, and that he kept coming back to the point that there were no hegemons, and that international disputes would arise, but these would be settled in a negotiated manner. And he kept calling for a return to, I think at one stage he called it classical diplomacy, which I will come back to that later on. But essentially, this was doing what Putin always does, which is like he dresses up his speeches, especially those that are aimed at sort of criticizing the US-led order. He dresses them up in a lot of like what I would call idealist verbiage to disguise the fact that essentially this is a dagger aimed at the heart of the United States. He says at one point when discussing BRICS that this is not, and I'm going to find his quote here. Yeah, that this isn't an anti-dollar strategy, and they're not being anti-dollar, but they've been denied the use of the dollar, which is true. But the increased settlements in local currencies in trade can't but be an anti-dollar maneuver. And this is the thing you find in Putin's speeches, and the same in Xi Jinping's as well, because they've got these domestic, and I think these are all true equally in Russia and in China, but in China is a little bit different. But in Russia, you have a domestic political and economic hierarchy, some of which desperately wants to see a restoration of relations with the United States and Europe in particular. That's the section of the Russian ruling structure represented by the likes of Kirill Dmitriev and others, and representing, of course, the wider Russian capitalist class, which is why you get this dance that Putin engages in, and other senior Russian officials as well, which is they'll do things like praise, like he praised Trump at various different points. He said that Trump had a very keen understanding of the situation in Ukraine, and that Trump listened attentively when he spoke to him at their meeting in Alaska, etc. And this, of course, is rather interesting because, first of all, on the idea of Trump listening attentively to anybody is, other than himself, is a bit of a joke. Anybody who worked with Trump will tell you that basically Trump is most impressed by the person who was speaking to him last. And so it may well be the case that Trump sat there in silence and listened to Putin, and maybe that some of it might have gone in. Then immediately afterwards, he listened to somebody else and it went out of his head again, And I don't buy those who make the argument that, well, Trump's in a complicated maneuver game with the deep state. It's like, no, he's not. Trump, again, I will go back to the point I made earlier in earlier streams. Trump is essentially doing a version of the policy that would have been pursued under Biden anyway, or Harris if she had won, which is that they can't sustain the war at the level that they were funding and arming it beforehand. They need to find some way of both keeping the war going, avoiding looking like they lost, and at the same time managing to palm the most of the management of it over onto the Europeans. This was probably going to be the plan no matter who was in the White House. And so Putin, reflecting the strong, desperate desire of the Russian capitalist class, so praised Trump, endorsed his supposed peace plan for Gaza, and said that he understands the situation, when it's pretty obvious that Trump doesn't. It's really, even if he did understand it, even if he did come away from the meeting with Putin with an understanding of how bad things are for Ukraine, and there are many in the US hierarchy who understand exactly how bad things are. Like, he'll talk to somebody else 5 minutes later and he'll have another understanding. This sort of praising of Trump and this attempt to curry favor with him, and this attempt to essentially offer inducements to various sections in the American ruling class about concessions they could get with it to do business within Russia. This is all going to fail, because even if Trump understood the situation and was actually serious about wanting to pursue an end to the war in Ukraine, the president has no power to do that on his own. The president of the United States is one man in a huge sprawling system who has much less influence than Putin does as president of Russia. There is a whole ruling class out there with its own, in the United States, with its own factions, its own think tanks. There is an entire political and ideological structure which is all dedicated to and designed for the relentless pursuit of the system of global domination which US imperialism needs to maintain in order to sustain itself. Like, the idea that Trump was going to be able to just walk away from Ukraine is a joke, to be perfectly honest. And the Russians do on some level appear to know that, but because of the deeply short-sighted, deeply reactionary and frankly comprador Russian ruling class that still has influence in the Russian government, quite obviously a considerable amount of influence, the Putin does this dance where he does this praise of Trump. Trump understands the situation. He mentioned the American guy who son of a former senior CIA official who died fighting for the Russian armed forces, and say, he's a Russian soldier, he represents the best of the MAGA movement. He even babbled on about fucking Charlie Kirk's assassination, which is just like, come on, man, seriously. All to try and continue the ingratiation campaign with Trump. None of this will pay off. None of this will ultimately pay dividends, because, again, even if Trump was a considerably smarter, more determined and more disciplined individual, even somebody of more political talents than Trump would not be able to overturn the huge institutional opposition to any real change of policy when it came to Russia. And of course, they continue their hostility against Russia's key allies, particularly China and Iran. And of course, the country Russia's just signed a series of very important agreements with Venezuela, though I made it clear on the last live stream that I really don't think that the Americans have the capability to invade Venezuela, but they continue harassing it, sanctioning it, trying to carry out various forms of intimidation. So again, like the speech of Putin again reflects the divisions within the Russian hierarchy that stem from the what I would call like the hidden peace party inside Russia, which is based around like the elements in the Russian capitalist class who still have extensive interests inside Europe and the United States, or would wish to expand those. And they're the ones who are desperate for this to come to a conclusion. The lucky thing from the point of view of the Russians is that the American ruling class, the great bulk of them anyway, and the Europeans can't let it come to an end. Like what nobody in, shall we say, the idealist world, and Putin very much, well, the Russian hierarchy very much exists, or rhetorically at least exists in the idealist world, appears to understand is that the conflict in Ukraine and the wider rabid hostility of the West, particularly, of course, the Western European imperialist powers and the United States toward Russia. I mean, Putin does touch on this, where he says, "Oh, it's not ideological," but then he says it's civilizational, which is also wrong. You see, Putin went into this sort of digression where he talked about the fact that the Soviet leaders wanted to end ideological competition, and then he says, "Oh, well, then we realized that the reason why they were going after the Soviet Union wasn't ideological; it was, it was civilizational. It was about Russia." And he then talks extensively about Russia as civilizational state. Now, I'll come back to that in just a moment. But again, like Putin's expressing like this. Again, it's an extension of the point of view of the sort of late period Soviet revisionists. In fact, even to the earlier period Soviet revisionists, that if they just gave up, give up the Cominform, give up the encouraging of the various different communist parties across the world to take the revolutionary line. If they instruct all of the communist parties and the imperialist nations to conciliate and become openly reformist, then that somehow with the stopping of the ideological competition, shall we say, that the situation would calm down. And accusing anybody who opposed this reformism and this capitulationism that they were being warmongers. And this proved to be a complete gibberish, of course, and as even Putin himself said, this led to this, as he sees it, leads to a complete collapse, part of what leads to a complete collapse of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet leadership sought to completely dismantle everything that could be perceived as a threat to the West. Now, in reality, what that was about was the emergence of particularly a Russian capitalist class as the most powerful capitalist element here, underground, and their influence within the hierarchy of the CPSU, leading to the dissolving of the Soviet Union. And further on, like Putin's sort of usual anti-communist statements, he, when talking about Russia as a civilizational entity, and I think he's committing an intellectual fraud when he makes this case, he's talking about the idea of Russia is the civilizational entity. The Russia in the time of the Tsar didn't have any divisions in it. Everybody was just Russian. If there was a passport, it just said Russian on it. Whereas the Soviets Lenin introduced this terrible nationality policy, which encouraged the dissolution of the country. Now, what that conveniently ignores is that before the Bolshevik Revolution, the country was falling apart anyway. There were nationalist risings before the country was pulled back together in a new form, in the form of the USSR. Putin and the Russian nationalists make this argument over and over again, and it's a false one, that the fault in one of the faults of the Soviet Union was the fact that they indulged the nationalisms of the constituent republics too much. Now, what they missed there is that the biggest single separatist in the late period Soviet Union was who? It was Yeltsin. It was Yeltsin. And the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which even United Russia had to admit was done illegally, was done by who? The leader of the RSFSR, Yeltsin, the leader of Ukraine, Kravchuk, and the leader of the Soviet Republic of Belarus, which is Sheikhovich. They're the ones that the three of them signed the Belovezhaya Accords, which ended the USSR. So the biggest speech, the biggest factor, biggest single factor in the dissolution of the USSR is Yeltsin. He was the biggest single separatist. So in actual fact, like if you can accuse the Soviet Union of indulging anyone too much, it was the leadership in Russia. But I mean, that's incorrect, will be an incorrect way of expressing it. Had the Soviet Union gone down the route that the Russian nationalists now wish that they wish that it had, of just running everything like the Tsarist Empire and denying essentially, not engage, following the Lenin and Stalin nationality policy, it wouldn't have made any difference towards separatism. In fact, separatism would have emerged quicker and more violently in terms of the breakup of the Soviet Union, because those nationalities would still have been there. The CIA and MI6 would still have been scheming. The exiles would still have been dreaming of a return. The underground pro-capitalist opposition would still have been petty bourgeois nationalists in their character. It was just that they would have been operating in a slightly different political structure. So it's a complete fucking pipe dream that the Russian nationalists and Putin himself are talking about here. It's nonsense. So there is that to dwell on as well, because then we go into the idea of Russia as this civilizational state where Putin says everybody here is just Russian. There are no divisions, and he goes back to the idea that there were no divisions under the Tsar, which is again complete nonsense. If you look at the way in which the nationality question was handled under the Tsar, and the way that the religion question was handled under the Tsar, so you start with the anti-Jewish pogroms and go from there. It was very clear that officially sanctioned state religion of Christianity was at the top, and everybody else was much lower down the food chain. And it was like European Russians were very much at the top, and nobody else was really considered. And the development of the non-European parts of Russia all came in the period of the USSR. Now, Putin's not stupid, he must know that, but then again, he's not just expressing his individual point of view, he's expressing the considered point of view of the Russian political establishment and the wider Russian capitalist class beyond that. And as somebody has said in the comments, like if Yeltsin had stayed in power and the Yeltsinites had continued, like Russia would have gone down the route of Yugoslavia. It would have been the ruling class in the United States and the ruling class in Britain in particular would have got what they wanted, which is the disintegration of the country. They were getting there in the mid-90s. To the point where you had, and Putin reflected upon this in his speech. He said towards the end, he talks about how everybody he expected and Sobchak expected everybody to join hands in the new world order following the collapse of the Soviet Union. They expected to be rewarded. Well, they were kicked in the bollocks, as it turned out, because Putin says himself, and again, he's talked about this before. He talked about how the United States was running Al-Qaeda operations in Chechnya. And again, this is something that other sources have confirmed. So like Sybil Edmonds, the FBI analyst who went public as a whistleblower over 9/11, has talked repeatedly about the fact that the CIA, and you can take that from this, the MI6 were engaged as well, were working with Ayman Zawahiri, remember him? Wonder where he is these days, to run Al-Qaeda networks in Chechnya. That's part of the reason why Putin was able to do the deal with Kadyrov, because Akhmat Kadyrov, who was a separatist, suddenly got worried that basically the entire country was being taken over by these dollar jihadists, shall we say, that were being brought in by like the US, the Brits, and the Saudis. And that formed the basis of a new settlement in Chechnya, which saw ultimately the Al Qaeda types exiled or killed or imprisoned. And Putin reflects on the fact that he saw evidence of this from George W. Bush, where he showed him the files that confirmed that they were involved in this. So, and of course, Putin is the Russian system is curious in that Putin will, on the one hand, say, and he said this, that the entirety of NATO essentially is making war on Russia. He'll say that on the one hand, and then he will say on the other hand, oh, I have a good working relationship with Emmanuel Macron. Maybe we can restore relations, etc., etc. Now, this again reflects divisions within Russia. It reflects also the fact that some of them don't want to admit fully what they are engaged in here, or what is being waged upon them, which is, because Putin actually says it's basically everything but a shooting war, because of course the NATO countries can't wage a shooting war. And so this is the status that we're at, the state that we're in with regard to like the Russian leadership, which is on the one hand, they realize, or a larger segment of them realizes, that they will have to win this militarily. They will have to push this militarily to a victorious conclusion by crushing the NATO-backed forces. And Putin again talked about the fact that Russia has the advantage in terms of nuclear missiles, in terms of the Oreshnik, in terms of the wider nuclear stockpiles. Though he said that the US has the advantage in the number of submarines, but in terms of the number of missiles, the Russians have the advantage. Again, a legacy gifted to the Russian Federation by it was the Brezhnev period in the USSR that reached the point where they could outproduce the United States in terms of missile systems. So there's always this strange hybrid going on with the Russian leaders, which is, on the one hand, they will say quite openly that they will have to fight this they're prepared to fight this to a conclusion, that the entirety of NATO is making war on them. And on the other hand, they'll say, but we're ready to re-enter into talks with our partners. What they don't explain fully, though Putin has gone close to this, and he did again in this speech, because they're not Marxists, even though many of them were at some point apparently trained in Marxism, at least to some degree. What they don't explain is the nature of imperialism, although Putin appears to understand it. When he said in that interview with Oliver Stone all those years ago that the president's changed but the policy doesn't, he does understand the practical effects of imperialism. But to believe that there could be some kind of rapprochement now in any other way than just a temporary ceasing of fire as the US attempts to readjust itself to certain new realities, to the need to rearrange its forces to focus on one priority or another, rather than trying to focus on 3 or 4 at the same time. What Putin and the Russian leaders will never say is the reason why the policy doesn't change. They sort of hide behind this nonsense about, Putin keeps saying, oh, well, it's because of a hostility to traditional values. At one point, he said, "Oh, it's because of Europe is haunted by radical leftism," which is a bit of that's something that some script writers taken straight from US fucking right-wing meme culture. Another point, he started talking about how there were nationalist voices rising in Germany and France, with the appearance, giving the appearance that he hoped that this would lead to political progress with regard to relations with Russia, between France, Germany, and Russia. Of course, whoever wrote that line, whether it's Putin himself or one of his scriptwriters, what he didn't seem to realize is that, or maybe didn't want to admit, is that the AfD will be will be if they get into government, which they might do, the chosen representatives of German imperialism. German imperialism, and here I owe this analysis in part to the comrades from the Kommunistische Organisation and my interviews I did with them. German imperialism requires the destruction of Russia and its dismembering as much as the British do, as much as the French do, as much as the US itself does. And you get these sort of multipolarists, and including Putin himself, saying that there was this partnership, and I remember he says he remembered going to speak to Helmut Kohl with Anatoly Sobchak back in the day, and back then Germany was committed to traditional moral values, which is bullshit, by the way. Like West Germany, traditional moral values, it was one of the fucking homes of the porn industry. It was notorious for it. So to explain why there is this rabid hostility from Germany, from France, they have to adopt like this idealist reactionary framing of, it's about values, it's about, globalists adopting like satanic practices and stuff like that. It's stuff that comes straight from sort of the Duginite sphere of stupidity. And so Putin ends up sounding absolutely ridiculous, trying to explain imperialism and the hostility of the imperialist powers toward Russia in non-materialist terms. You end up like sounding like a babbling fool, which he's not. He's very much not. But that's what happens when you try and explain a material force. Imperialism is not an idea. It's not a set of ideas. It is a material force that is present within the imperialist countries and globally. It is a material force that represents, of course, it's the development of capitalism beyond the stage of commodity production into the stage of capital export, and then going through the phase of deindustrialization into purely capital export. And that's why you've reached crisis point. It's why these countries are deindustrializing. It's not just because Russian energy got cut off, though that's part of it. These countries are deindustrializing because this is the way that capitalism moves in its imperialist phase. And Germany is an imperialist power. Yes, it is an imperialist power, which is obliged at this stage to play a subservient role to the United States. But it's still an imperialist power. German ruling class policy reflects German ruling class needs, which is for continued expansion into the East in terms of conquest of new markets. But because Germany has been stagnating economically, relatively speaking, compared to its previous phases of growth for many years now. Its growth has been slowing down all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s. None of the major EU economies ever really recovered from the crash of 2008. They basically managed to limp forward slightly. So they are in a deep crisis, which is getting worse. And Germany, France, Britain all require the defeat of Russia. All of them. This is absolutely something that they require as much as the US does. And this is the problem with trying to, even when Putin and the Russian state are engaged in an, objectively speaking, a revolutionary act in terms of directly taking on the US imperialists, well, via their proxy army in Ukraine. The problem is, though, that you can do that, but you're at the same time trying to pretend that you can continue with business as usual in terms of the Russian economic policy, which is still, in terms of the policy of the Russian central bank, geared around enabling capital export, which is still basically trying to appease the Russian capitalist class. So the Russian state can continue its war because it's based on the solid foundations of the old Soviet industrial base and has expanded upon that. But it's lugging around this material and ideological dead weight called the Russian bourgeoisie, which is why Putin ends up making all these nonsensical statements. And that's what I took away from like the speech was like, it's remarkable that somebody or this system, this Russian system, has been forced by the rabid hostility, which is very explainable, of the Western system, into this confrontation with the NATO bloc, with the EU bloc, with US imperialism itself, whilst at the same time trying to explain that in idealist terms. And because they can't, if they start to explain it in materialist terms, well, then there's the danger that people might start to ask questions about the material conditions in Russia itself and why they've ended up in this situation. They've ended up in this situation because the Russian bourgeoisie had no interest in actually defending Russian sovereignty and independence for many, many years, and was happy just to grab the money and send it out of the country. Had it been left up to the Russian bourgeoisie, then there would be no Russia. They'd have sacrificed it completely. It's only because of the balance of forces at the end of the 90s that forced the creation of a Bonapartist system that now exists, and which stabilized the situation in Russia. That's what's going. That's the remarkable thing here. Right. So I'm gonna just dive through the comments and questions here. So hello to Svetlana, hello to Robert, hello to David in the FRG, hello to Grassy Knoll, hello to Working Prole Incorporated, hello to Jerry, James Graham, Anthony McKeown, Jan Stobb, Chandler, Enigma, Dexter, who is on Rumble. So we're live on Rumble, Kick, YouTube, Twitch, and X, of course. So we've also got David Almir. We've got Caustic Grip. We have Paul McCord. Good to see you here. We have Travis. And we also have Pavel coming to us from Zionist Austria. Sounds rather unappealing. Hello to Zamar. Hello to Albert Witch Vigler. Zamar says, any reflections on the Hamas response to the peace plan? We'll be covering a West Asian update tomorrow, probably at a slightly earlier time, so be sure to join us then. Yes, Almir, you can, the Goodfellas review is, yes, part of our ongoing project to review many Scorsese movies, so be sure to check that out. Hello to Will Johnson, Comrade Jawad as well. Hello to Jonas Levinson. Let's have a look. Bruce Albert says, yes, also, the physics metaphor was not really accurate. As Max Planck himself said, science progresses one funeral at a time, recognizing institutional limits, something Putin does not. Yeah. It's a very strange tangle that he gets himself in when he tries to talk about the reasons for the current state of the world. It always comes across as like, partly like you always end up with thinking that it's remarkable that he can spend so much time avoiding a properly materialist explanation, but that's the nature of the Russian bourgeoisie and their presence in the system. And the fact that Putin himself has always essentially been a liberal, just a liberal who's been sort of forced down a more radical route by the balance of forces in his country. And also the fact that I think as an individual, he is quite sincere in that he wants to retain the integrity of the Russian state. He would have taken all manner of deals with the West had the West been prepared to offer them. But the West was, as he actually said, the West was never prepared to offer any kind of deal other than total subjugation. Vera asks, I wonder if many of the Russian public are tired of Putin's Trump praises. I'm certain there'll be a big group that is. Hello to Asif K. Where are we? Hello to Michael McGoldrick, Abtin, Holger Ritter. David King says, time Putin stopped praising the orange baboon. You're doing a disservice to baboons there, David. Zamar says, the speech does not refute the propaganda that that Dugin is Putin's brain. Yep. Caustic Grip says, if Yeltsin hadn't resigned, Russia would be the size of Estonia by now. Yes, that's very true. Jonas Levinson says Russia wouldn't exist if there were no USSR. Very true. Neither would Ukraine, many other states. Yeah. Svetlana says Tsarist Russia was rotten to the core. Over 70% lived in grinding poverty and over 80% were illiterate. You could write your name, you were literate. Romantic ideas of old Russia are absurd. Yes, that's true. Christiana F is the perfect artistic expression of West Germany's cultural values, says Caustic Grip. Very true. Haven't heard that one for a very long time. Hello to Mark Pouliers. Good to have you with us. Bruce Albert says, according to Alexander Makuros of the Duran, Russia was able to support the war because of a bank messaging system. Well, that's where idealism will get you. Abolish NATO says, do you think being a Marxist-Leninist is directly at odds with multipolarism? Well, I would say that I've always said that multipolarism is a phase. It's a phase that we are going through right now, which is the disintegration. And I think it'll be a slower disintegration than many hope of the unipolar world. But what the multipolar one is the slow defeat in terms of the US's ability to sort of exert power in the world. But it doesn't mean the end of imperialism. The imperialist bloc will remain there, and it will remain determined to regain its former dominance for a long time to come, for at least a while to come. It also means that a series of very contradictory phenomena, like Putin's Russia and the Islamic Republic of Iran being another one, are sort of forced into a confrontation which the bourgeoisies of both countries didn't want, which the bourgeoisie in China didn't want either. But they've been forced into it, and they've been forced to reckon with the nature, the aggressive nature of imperialism. But they can't quite bring themselves because of the nature of the sort of class forces in each country, to be fully open about the facts, about the situation they're in. The people who come closest to it, funnily enough, like Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, and some of the more nationalistic elements in Russia. Putin himself occasionally will express a more proper anti-imperialist understanding, but then he always layers over the top of it with idealist nonsense. So are we at odds with multipolarism? No, because multipolarism is a fact. It's a necessary stage given the phase we came out of, which is an extremely reactionary phase. The breaking down of the power of the United States and its movement towards a sort of a more constrained imperialist power, its movement into crisis. This is all part of the unfolding of the historical process. So we doesn't put us at odds with it, but I would say that being a Marxist-Leninist should give you a proper understanding of the multipolar moment, which is that it's not the answer. Like, if Russia wins the war against the NATO forces in Ukraine, it won't remove the wild class contradictions inside Russia itself. It won't stop the class struggle inside Russia itself. It'll just mean that particular phase of like US British-led aggression will come to a close. But the struggle within Russia against the Russian capitalist class will continue and, in fact, intensify. It's going to be very interesting to see how that struggle develops once this war against the NATO forces is ultimately won. So yes, multipolarism is not the answer. It is a phase we're going through. It is to reiterate the answer to abolish NATO's point. It is a phase we're going through which sees the rapid decline, or actually a rapid decline of US power, and then an attempt by the US ruling class and its bloc to respond. We'll have to see how we go from there. But the future will be shaped by the class struggles in the multipolar nations, and also the class struggle inside the imperial core. As life gets worse, there will be more resistance. Is it perhaps a sense of civilizational superiority that makes the Putin government think that it can handle Western imperialism? It's an interesting question, Anthony. I mean, Putin said He's talked about how Russia is an old civilization, China is an even older civilization. There is this rather daft idea that some of them do express, that because the US imperialism is a newer civilization, that the old civilizations can outwit it somehow by just drawing on ancient knowledge or something, or I don't know, rubbing a lamp or something. It is, I think, a very foolish notion if that is indeed what they believe. Look, the old civilization of old China, pre-revolution China, pre-Kuomintang China, the China of the emperors, was very old and was picked apart by technologically and politically more advanced nations in the 19th century. And it was picked apart to the point where, as I said on the stream last night, the Chinese refer to that period with quite some justification as the century of humiliation. So you can be an old civilization. It doesn't mean that you are able to have some sort of inherent value to that you can understand and combat the new and aggressive powers. This is just simply not the case. It's nonsense, basically. Please explain a bit about Bonapartism, asks Frank. Well, Bonapartism, again, refers to both the systems, more refers to the system run by Napoleon III than Napoleon I, though, of course, there are certain continuities there. Napoleon III is, of course, the study, the subject of study by Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and his writings on France after the 1848 revolution. He identifies Bonapartism as being a situation where, due to the deadlock in the class struggle, that the state, in this case the bourgeois state, is able to raise itself above the contending classes for a while and to essentially manage relations between them, so that it's still a bourgeois regime, but the state, in the case of the Russian state, goes into the hands of a bunch of largely security men, intelligence officials, military types, who essentially use institute a Bonapartist system in order to essentially compel, for a while at least, certain aspects of the Russian capitalist class to behave themselves, to defend, as Putin has done, the integrity of the Russian state, and to have a chance of it actually sort of restoring basic functionality. And to do that, they had to step out and away from, or reduce and remove the ability of the Russian bourgeois to just run the state into the ground. So Putin told the Russian bourgeois, and this is what I mean by Bonapartism, he's able to tell them to do certain things in a way that Keir Starmer, for instance, would not do, in a way that Macron wouldn't do. Though originally the French Fifth Republic was set up more as a Bonapartist system under de Gaulle. And also the Russian system has the ability to portray itself as at least as the arbitrator between the different classes. That's not necessarily true. The bourgeoisie is still the ruling class. But the Russian the fact that Putin had to adopt Bonapartist methods, which is, again, elevating the state to a position where it rises slightly above the day-to-day class struggle, and he's able to tell the bourgeoisie from time to time what it can and can't do, put limits on its behavior in a way that arguably that doesn't really happen in the Western nations. So, I mean, I could do a whole program on Bonapartism. Let me know if that'd be something that you would be interested in. Mo 1917, yes, you're right. Multipolarity is transitional phase of US decline. Let's just go on here. Edward asks, when will communists regain international positions they have lost with the collapse of the USSR, as Stalin predicted? What would happen if the USSR lost? Well, it'll take really a revolution in a major country, I would say. Once we get to that point, once we get to a revolution in a major country, then we will see a recovery of the global communist movement. I mean, what made the global communist movement as big as it was for as long as it was the fact that the Russian Revolution, followed by the Chinese Revolution, overturned capitalism and feudalism and foreign domination in two of the biggest countries in the world. And in the Soviet case, overturned bourgeois Russia following the destruction of Tsarist Russia, and that inspired a global movement, which eventually got run into the ground and destroyed. This will happen again. It will happen again because there will be the point where we get to a revolutionary situation again. And our job as communists in the various countries that we're in is to build patiently until we reach that point. Now, Nehat, you say you'd be interested in the explanation of Bonapartism. Right, so I will schedule that in. I have got to draw things to a close for tonight. It's a slightly shorter one, but we'll be back tomorrow with a consideration of the West Asian question. So please be sure to join me for that one. And also, we got 2 big interviews coming up on decline and fall in the upcoming week. Keep an eye out for those. And thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Couldn't do this without you. I'll be back again tomorrow for the West Asian update. Please join me for that. But until then, thank you for watching, and here's your outro video.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.